March 17, 2026. We are in the 5th year, day 22 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will once again take a look at the situation on the front lines. We will also look at some quite interesting things, such as what Russia is currently planning in the occupied territories. And we will also see that they are no longer able to protect large oil depots. Yesterday, we took a look at the situation of the various Russian army groups and their possible objectives for the spring offensive in 2026. Russia launches an offensive every year without interruption. There is a spring offensive, a summer offensive, an autumn offensive, a winter offensive, then a short winter break, and then the spring offensive starts again the next year. And that's basically been the case since 2022, while on the Ukrainian side, we can usually only talk about one offensive per year. For example, there was the offensive in 2022, the so-called counteroffensive. Then in 2023, there was the Ukrainian summer offensive. Then in 2024 and 2025, there was no offensive at all. Or rather, that's not true. Then, at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, there was the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, where they were able to capture an area as large as Berlin in the Russian region of Kursk. But that wasn't planned. It more or less developed spontaneously, you could almost say. The lack of real resistance on the Russian side was not expected, nor that the Federal Security Service would be unable to hold the borders. That's typical, but the fact that the conscripts basically surrendered in large numbers and that this made larger Ukrainian territorial gains possible, that wasn't planned. At first, they tried to destroy the new advanced outposts and assembly points of the Russians, because the Ukrainians assumed that the Russians wanted to launch an offensive with the Sumy region. They wanted to preempt that with a preemptive strike and then realized, oh, we're making progress faster than we actually expected. And so they stayed, but that's not really the point here. We simply see that on the Russian side, there's one offensive after another. On the Ukrainian side, well, at most one per year. And they've also announced one for 2026. But today, we want to take another look at the situation on the Russian side, just to continue from yesterday's situation report, because we're going to go into a bit more detail. But before that, a quick message from Pat.
I'm currently driving through a drone corridor. Honestly, that's a bit too dangerous for me. And the global positioning system signal is gone. And I was just somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. I'm just going to drive back to a village now. Then they can come there, please. I'll let them know where I am.
Hello, I'm Pat. I don't just take care of the merch for war and tactic, but I've also been regularly bringing vehicles to Ukraine for over a year. Funded by your support through Ukraine Aid Berlin, I cover the trips out of my own pocket. In the past, you've helped me incredibly with this. Now, there are 2 more trips coming up, and in addition, a complicated repair. You can find all the information, updates, and other projects on the GoFundMe page in the video description. The scene you saw at the beginning of the video is from January 2026. After experiencing in Kiev what -20 degrees and up to 20 hours a day without electricity feel like, and literally having rockets fly past my head in Kharkiv, another situation has developed in the south. A meeting point was actually planned in Persho-Travensk between Pavlorad and Prokropsk, which had just been captured by the Russians at that time. However, due to global positioning system jamming, I ended up driving several kilometers closer to the front. There will be more about that soon. Feel free to check out the GoFundMe page, and in the next 2 days my documentary from my summer trip to Sumy will also be released. I appreciate every cent and your support. At the end of today's situation report, you'll also see the trailer for my documentary.
In the area around Kupiansk, the situation has remained relatively calm for several months. Larger offensive operations are currently not being observed. This is about this area. Kramatorsk, Sloviansk here, and Kupiansk up here far in the north. And along this route, we've seen several offensives here recently, haven't we? Well, you can't really call them offensives. These are more like attacks by Russian sabotage and infiltration troops who are trying to make some gains here or attack smaller Ukrainian positions and then eliminate them. They're doing this step by step at a rather, let's say, slow pace. You can't really talk about a large-scale offensive. Still, these targets here are very interesting for Russia, especially the towns here in Donbass, namely Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, which are considered the last major cities and also the last major defensive line of the Ukrainians. Before it then moves into the next oblast, the front section is still quite stable at the moment, but there is increasing activity. This is being observed from Russian forces who are trying to achieve localized territorial gains here, and above all, to tie down Ukrainian forces and reserves and to force them to withdraw from the main combat areas in Donbass. We see something similar up here near Sumy, specifically at this location. Nothing has been moving forward here for some time either, yet many units from both sides are still tied down here. The Russians wanted to at least reach this point, to advance to this dashed line, which so far doesn't seem attainable. But here, infiltration attempts have clearly increased, especially in the last few weeks. It's less about gaining a large amount of territory and more about an operational war of attrition tactic, aiming to apply pressure along a broad front line. Overall, the pace of Russian territorial gains remains quite low. In the first 17 days of March, so in the last 17 days according to estimates, about 80 square kilometers were captured, not near Sumy, but along the entire front. This figure is clearly below the previous months and is at a level that was already known from last year. At the same time, Ukraine continues to invest in deep strikes in the Russian hinterland, especially targeting factories. We will take another look at this later. In the past 2.5 months, more than 270 long-range attacks have been documented. Among them were 16 attacks on Russian air defense systems, which suggests that Kiev is systematically trying to create gaps in Russian air defenses and improve the conditions for further attacks. And targets of such attacks include, for example, the Leninsk oil depot, which we already looked at yesterday, from the Krasnodar region. It was heavily hit and significantly damaged, and it seems that the Russians were no longer able to bring the fire under control. The fire continued to spread, apparently throughout the entire complex, and in the available footage you can clearly see that large parts of the facility are destroyed. In the video, you can also clearly see that the infrastructure of the depot has largely failed. Now, the war in Ukraine is continuing, and Russia now has a lot of destroyed but also conquered, or rather occupied territory, since the war is not over yet. So what do you do with all that space now? Well, according to Russian and Ukrainian media, Russia is planning to relocate more than 100,000 of its own citizens to the occupied territories of Ukraine. The basis for this is said to be so-called development programs for the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. There are also indications of such plans from Russian sources. According to this, 15 master plans and 10 territorial change development projects have been drawn up, which officially aim to increase the population of Russian descent in these areas, and of course, to expand the infrastructure. At least that's how it's officially described. In practice, however, there is much to suggest that this is less about a classic reconstruction program and more about targeted demographic restructuring. Such an approach is very reminiscent of Soviet strategies, where political control was consolidated and occupied regions were integrated in the long term through resettlement. Likewise, the cohesion among the population is supposed to be broken through resettlement. As a small example, to help you better imagine it, just imagine that Switzerland was conquered by Germany. Now, the Swiss have a very strong sense of national identity, a very strong connection to their country or region, to their customs, traditions, and of course to the population. And that would always create potential for tensions in the occupied or newly annexed territories. So what do? You take the Swiss population and simply distribute them all across Germany, and then you take German citizens and send them to Switzerland. And then they no longer have strong groups, they're scattered and naturally lose their cohesion. And that's roughly how they want to do it in the occupied regions as well, because that's how Stalin did it, and it worked very well. It did lead to a great famine, but not to a revolt. In addition, Russian authorities announced plans to expand tourism in the occupied territories by 2044, well, assuming they've even won the war by then, with the goal of attracting up to 10 million visitors. These plans may seem ambitious given the current security situation, but they show that Moscow is apparently trying to bring the occupied regions permanently under its influence, not only militarily, but also economically and socially. By the way, about a year ago, there was also a proposal to build a roller coaster or an amusement park on the ruins or in the ruins of some cities. So, as always, The Russians are full of ideas, regardless of whether they make sense. But let's take another look at the front at a different section, namely Kostyantynivka, where there is still heavy fighting going on right now. The intense positional battles are still ongoing. Russian forces of the 6th Motorized Rifle Divisions, supported by territorial regiments such as the 1317th and 1008th, are continuing their slow but steady advance toward the city. The main focus runs along the northern edge. Already by the end of January 2026, Russian assault groups of the 1307th Regiment were able to capture the Metallurg Garden Complex, and Ukrainian forces, especially the 501st Marine Infantry Battalion, were pushed back toward the city. By the way, the Garden Complex is located here. This is what lies a bit further north of the position of the 1307th Regiment. After an operational pause, the attacks resumed at the beginning of March. The current focus is now on the neighboring Chemic Garden Complex, with the goal of the Russian forces being to open a direct access to the city from the east. The operation aims to cut off the supply route to Shasevia, a key line for the Ukrainian 24th Mechanized Brigade, which continues to defend east of Shasevia. Already in the first days of the 1st, in the first half of February, Russian units managed to occupy the tactically important hill 244. This enables further attacks on the last Ukrainian defensive line before Cherwon, which relies on the small forest complex south of the village. What is striking, however, is that a nearby, heavily fortified, the fortification point is apparently not occupied, which could indicate structural problems in the use of prepared defensive positions. However, the Ukrainian side continues to hold the strategic position at elevation 211, which is up here. As I said, this area is occupied by the Russians. I don't know how much of elevation 244 they were able to capture, as I just reported, but it is largely under Russian control. Ukrainian forces firmly control elevation 211 in the city's northeast, now defended by the 3rd Battalion of the 5th. Assault Brigade has been under the 24th Brigade's battle group for about 15 minutes. As long as we hold the position, full Russian fire control over the supply route is unlikely. Why did I mention the 24th? Why did I emphasize the 24th Brigade being subordinated again? Well, it's simple. The reason is that the 5th Brigade is here in the area, but only partially. A larger part is fighting together with the 255th Regiment near Hujapole. You know, the Ukrainians usually use the strategy of splitting up their brigades, whether it's their companies or battalions, and spreading them across several front sectors instead of keeping them in one sector. I've already explained the advantages and disadvantages several times, so I won't go into them again now. Overall, however, the area around Kostyantynivka shows a fairly typical picture. Slow Russian advances with quite heavy losses, combined with targeted pushes toward key terrain, while the Ukrainian defense tries to secure key heights and supply routes to prevent an operational breakthrough. But this usually leads to the Russians achieving their objectives sooner or later with enough effort. In the section at the bend of the Siverskyi Donets, the positional battles also continue unchanged. The area's importance is rising as it falls under the Ukrainian Solidar group's responsibility. If Russia launches a major spring and summer offensive, which we also expect, the section between these two settlements, namely Menkivka and Sakitina, is considered a possible focal point. On the left flank of the GT Solidar, that is, in the Sakitina area, the 81st is currently involved in the west. Airborne Brigade against attacks by several Russian units, that's right here at this location. The starting point of the Russian attacks is already an existing bridgehead on the southern bank of the Donetsk, which includes the western part of the village. The 7th Motorized Rifle Brigade is attacking the 2nd Battalion 81st positions from there. Brigade, with Russian forces mainly relying on small dismounted assault groups of just 2 to 3 men, so these are more like stormtroopers. They are trying to advance along the trench. The goal is to occupy the wooded areas east of Krivoluka. Additionally, along this axis, reconnaissance and sabotage groups from the Donetsk People's Republic are regularly deployed, trying to disrupt the supply route at Kalinkis-Sakitina further south. At the same time, The 6th Motorized Rifle Brigade is carrying out attacks on the southern parts of the settlement, specifically at this location. These are being conducted by the 90th Battalion of the 81st Airborne Brigade, at least for now. Additionally, the Russian side is using the previously captured Height 153 to infiltrate small infantry groups into the Ukrainian lines from there. We saw something like that before at Dvoipilya. A recent attack combined an advance along the road with a multi-purpose towed light armored vehicle and motorized units, while at the same time dismounted forces attacked from Height 153. However, the attack failed. Ukrainian drone units of the 90th Battalion were able to destroy the multi-purpose towed light armored vehicle along with its crew before it could reach the Ukrainian positions. I tried to include it here in the situation report, but the video is a bit too graphic for YouTube. I'll see if I can upload it to Telegram later. Overall, the situation in this sector continues to be characterized by numerous small-scale skirmishes. Russian forces continue to rely on infiltration in small assault groups, while the Ukrainian side maintains its defense mainly through drone reconnaissance and by countering with drone strikes as enemy forces approach. Last but not least, Nava People's Republic. What is that supposed to be? Well, currently there is content circulating about an alleged Nava People's Republic, all of which have the typical characteristics of a coordinated information operation. The goal is less about the actual secession of the city of Nava, which is partly Russian and partly Estonian, and more about deliberately destabilizing a NATO and European Union member state. Because the Nava area is particularly sensitive from the Russian perspective. The region is currently on the border with Russia and has a high proportion of Russian-speaking population. Exactly such areas are strategically suitable for narratives about oppressed minorities in the neighboring country or alleged separatist movements. What stands out, of course, is the way this information is spread. The content ranges from memes and symbolism to radical calls, but is mostly spread by a small anonymous group of many bot accounts with minimal reach. This suggests that it's not about real mobilization, but rather about creating an artificial mood or atmosphere. It is intended to create the impression that separatist ideas are circulating and socially anchored, even though there is, of course, no solid basis for this. Well, you already know this approach from 2014, when similar narratives were built up on social media in Ukraine before a real conflict landscape developed from them. What are they trying to achieve if it's so obvious? Well, on the one hand, it's about internal urban stabilization, and on the other hand, testing reactions, observing how society, the media, and security authorities respond, as well as preparing narratives and, well, carrying them out. Because portraying Estonia as an unstable border region to create international pressure or doubt is, of course, also one of the goals on the Russian side. Of course, it's important to note that this is not a real call to action, but rather a purely digital campaign without any visible real movement on the ground.
So I was just in the city and got myself something to eat and so on. This morning, as I said, I heard artillery fire, and yeah, now there's the first air raid alarm, but I can show you that, you know. So nobody is running away or anything like that. People are just staying as usual. That's how it is. I'm not scared or anything either. I'm just thinking about it.
According to local rescue workers, dozens of people have been killed in a Russian missile attack on the eastern Ukrainian city of Sumy. The attack happened when many people were out on the street. According to the Ministry of the Interior, many more people were injured.
Hi, my name is Ted, and I usually take care of merchandise or other nerd stuff on my channel. But for a year now, I've also been regularly traveling to Ukraine and bringing vehicles like these, which are used as frontline rescue vehicles. And thanks to donations collected by Ukraine Hilfe Berlin, we regularly go to Ukraine. And I deliver them there and bring them directly to the medical units. And in today's video, yes, we'll take a look at the trip from last summer, which went to Sumy, right at the front line. And it was not only an exciting journey, but also an exciting stay. Yes, enjoy the video.
Thanks for listening, subscribers, channel members, and the Algae crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renee Kessler, who left the Jumel Hufe. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next situation report. Bye.